20 silver coins for a girl. 10 if she was lame. That sounds like a slave market. But in Rome, the true price of purity was measured differently. A woman in bridal veil carrying breadwater and a lamp was led not to her husband's house, but to her tomb. She would be buried alive beneath the city walls, sealed in earth and silence. Rome called it ritual. We would call it cruelty. Who truly paid the cost of this purity? Chronicles fall silent. Archaeology and law codes whisper the truth. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, bones still speak. Now, imagine the scene. A solemn procession moves through the forum. Crowds part, but no cheers rise. At the center, veiled in white, walks not a bride, but a condemned Vestal Virgin. She is among the most honored women of Rome, guardians of the sacred flame, given wealth, property, and privileges unthinkable for ordinary women. Yet one accusation, that she allowed the fire to die, or worse, that she broke her vow of chastity, means death in the most merciless way. And here lies the paradox. Rome revered the Vestals as near divine symbols of the empire's survival. Yet, when suspicion touched them, reverence vanished, replaced by ritualized annihilation. No epitaph marked their grave, no prayers followed their name. They were erased as if purity once broken had never existed at all. So why did Rome bury its sacred daughters alive? What did these women represent that made them untouchable in life, yet disposable in death? In the next parts we'll walk their path. Children taken into service. Priestesses of power and scapegoats offered to the gods when fear and politics demanded sacrifice. The path toward becoming a Vestal Virgin did not begin with a woman's decision. It began with a child's removal. In Rome, girls as young as 6, rarely older than 10, were singled out for a destiny that would set them apart from every other girl in the city. On an appointed day, the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest and keeper of tradition, oversaw a ceremony the Romans themselves called captio, a word that meant capture. The name was chillingly accurate. Before a watching crowd, the priest would extend his hand, and the moment it clasped a girl's, her life was changed forever. The legal power of her father, the patria potestas, that ruled every household, was dissolved, and the child became property of the goddess Vesta. From then on, she belonged not to her parents, not even to herself, but to the sacred flame at the center of Rome. The rules that determined who could be chosen were rigid, designed to project Rome's vision of purity. A candidate had to be freeborn, her parents both alive. That detail was no accident. 2 living parents were thought to signal strength and stability, a mirror of the unbroken lineage the Vestals were meant to embody. She could not be an orphan, nor marked by physical imperfection, nor burdened by a family name stained by scandal. The selection emphasized flawless continuity. In the early centuries of the Republic, this meant almost exclusively patrician families, the ancient nobility. For those houses, the selection of a daughter was both crushing and exalting, a mark that their family was pure and powerful enough to offer Rome one of its most sacred treasures. But not every noble house was eager. Prestige was shadowed by sacrifice, and when the girl's name was called, in the forum pride on the surface often masked private despair. Ancient sources describe the ceremony with words drawn from weddings. The pontifex would take the chosen girl's hand as a father might lead a bride. He would declare her carissima capta, beloved captive. It was an odd phrase, tender and brutal at once. Everyone understood the symbolism. The girl was leaving one family to be joined to another. But her bridegroom was not a mortal man, it was a goddess, and behind the goddess stood the Roman state. The ritual blurred the line between celebration and mourning. Families were expected to rejoice, yet tears were not uncommon. Mothers knew they would no longer watch their daughters grow into wives or mothers. Fathers knew their legal authority was severed in an instant. For the girl herself, the moment was bewildering. In the same heartbeat, she became both exalted and exiled. The walk from the Forum to the Atrium Vestae was short in distance, but immense in meaning. The atrium stood beside the small round temple of Vesta, where the sacred flame burned. The route symbolized the passage from private to public, from child to emblem. Neighbors and strangers alike lined the streets to witness the transformation. Some whispered blessings, others marveled at the family's new honor, but all understood the finality. Behind the child faded the warmth of a household siblings, playmates, the smell of bread baking in the morning. Ahead stood marble corridors and solemn silence, a home that promised grandeur but demanded absolute service. For the new initiate, each step was both a farewell and an initiation. Inside the atrium, the girl was introduced to her new world. The house itself was magnificent. By Roman standards, archaeology reveals courtyards with fountains, mosaic floors, and statues commemorating earlier Vestals. But beauty was only the surface. Beneath it lay a strict system that governed every moment. Senior Vestals themselves, taken as children years earlier, welcomed the new arrival and began her instruction. She was robed in white, not to mark her as a wife, but to signal her purity and devotion to a flame. Statues lining the halls reminded her of the women who had come before, their names etched in stone, as if to say, "This is your new lineage, your new family." The symbolism of the captio extended further than the family's loss or the girl's gain. Romans believed the hearth was the heart of every home, and the goddess Vesta embodied that hearth for the entire city. By choosing a child without blemish, Rome reassured itself that its collective hearth was pure, unbroken, and worthy of divine favor. The Vestal was more than a girl. She was a reflection of Rome's ideal image of itself. This was why the requirements were so strict, why families wept as they celebrated, and why the ceremony resembled marriage. It tied the fate of the individual directly to the fate of the state. Over time, as patrician families grew reluctant to surrender their daughters, the rules loosened. By the late Republic and early Empire, even daughters of equestrian families or freedmen could be considered. Yet the ritual itself never softened. The hand of the pontifex still drew a child away. The words of beloved captive still cut families in two, and the path to the Atrium Vestae still ended with doors closing on the girl's old life. The balance of pride and grief, honor and loss remained unchanged. To the Romans, it was precisely this duality that made the Vestals sacred. They embodied sacrifice not only of self, but of family. For the child, the first days in her new home must have been overwhelming. Gone were the chatter of siblings and the familiar rhythm of household chores. Instead, she found herself surrounded by ritual silence, by the murmur of fountains in enclosed courtyards, by the stern but steady guidance of elder Vestals. Each new rule learned was a brick in the wall between who she had been and who she must now become. Her trinkets of girlhood ribbons, dolls, the small treasures of innocence, were surrendered. In return, she was given a robe duties and a title that carried both reverence and danger. She had crossed a threshold no one could cross back. The Romans insisted this was the greatest honor a girl could achieve, and in many respects they were right. In time, she would hold privileges no other woman in Rome could imagine, but the price was already clear in her parents' tears, in her own sudden silence, and in the word that named the ceremony itself, capture. From that moment forward, she was a child no longer. She was the bride of a flame, the daughter of a goddess, and a living symbol upon whom the fortune of Rome was said to rest. Once chosen, the life of a Vestal Virgin unfolded according to a strict rhythm of 30 years. The Romans divided those decades into 3 stages, learning service and teaching each a decade long, each more demanding than the last. From the moment she stepped into the Atrium Vestae as a child, her days were mapped out with a precision that left little room for self. What to outsiders appeared like privilege and grandeur was, in reality, an education in discipline, ritual, and unrelenting scrutiny. The first 10 years were years of learning. A newly chosen girl, barely past her childhood, was surrounded by older Vestals who had themselves once walked the same narrow path. They trained her not through books, but through repetition, memory, and example. She learned the formulas of prayer, the gestures of sacrifice, the order of ceremonies. Nothing was trivial. To burn incense incorrectly, or to carry water in the wrong vessel, could be interpreted as disrespect to the goddess and a dangerous omen for the state. The Romans believed that errors in ritual displeased the gods, and divine displeasure was never a private matter. It threatened the entire city. So the child's apprenticeship was as rigorous as any military drill. Only the battlefield was the hearth of the goddess, and the stakes were Rome's survival. The middle decade was the heart of her service. By this stage, she was no longer a child, but a young woman expected to shoulder the full burden of her office. Central to this was the sacred flame of Vesta, which burned perpetually in the round temple beside her residence. Day and night, year after year, that fire was never allowed to die. To the Romans, it was more than light and warmth. It was the beating heart of the city, the spark that symbolized continuity through war, famine, and triumph alike. Ordinary Romans tended their own hearths in their homes, but the Vestal's flame was the hearth of the entire state. If it went out, many believed disaster loomed, invasion, plague, or civil collapse. The young Vestal thus became a sentinel at the city's core, her sleepless watch bound to the fortunes of empire. Her duties spread beyond the fire. She prepared sacred substances, like the mola salsa cakes of flour and salt, that played a central role in sacrifices across the city. She drew water from a spring regarded as pure never from the common fountains. She participated in festivals that reminded the Romans of their pact with the gods. Each task may have seemed mundane to the uninitiated, but in Roman eyes, they sustained the cosmic contract that bound city and deity together. The Vestal's hands, small and white, carried not just food or water, but the weight of divine favor. The final decade transformed the Vestal from servant to teacher. Having endured years of scrutiny and internalized the minute details of ritual, she now passed them on to the next generation. Young girls, bewildered as she once had been, arrived at the atrium, and found in her a guide both stern and compassionate. In these years, the Vestal's authority was at its peak. She ensured that the sacred formulas were recited without flaw, that the rhythm of the temple life continued unbroken. Through her instruction, the traditions of centuries were preserved with almost mathematical precision. Rome changed in those centuries. Emperors rose and fell, armies conquered, and were conquered. But within the temple, the flame and the words remained the same. Archaeological remains remind us that this was not mere metaphor. The hearth in the Temple of Vesta burned continuously, its ashes preserved and carefully disposed of as sacred. The round shape of the temple itself evoked the form of a household hearth, magnified to civic scale. In every Roman home, the fire represented survival warmth and family unity. In the temple, the Vestal's fire symbolized those same things for the entire empire. It was as if the fate of millions had been gathered into a single flame, and 6 women were tasked with its eternal preservation. This symbolism gave the Vestals immense symbolic authority. They were not mothers. In the ordinary sense, they bore no children, they married no men, but they were mothers of Rome in a higher sense. Their virginity and their ritual service tied them directly to the health of the state. Each decade of their 30 years, whether learning, serving, or teaching, was designed to reinforce that role. And once their 30 years were complete, the Vestals were free at last to leave the atrium. They could marry, though many chose not to. They could live as private women again, but forever carried an aura of awe. By then, however, youth had slipped away, and the years of cloister left their mark. Some remained in the house until death, as if unable to cross again into the ordinary world. Through this 30-year cycle, the Vestal Virgins embodied the paradox of Rome itself: rigor and ritual sustaining power and grandeur. Their decades were not their own. They were mapped by the state, each phase serving a purpose that reached far beyond the individual. Childhood was consumed by training youth, by duty, maturity by teaching. And through it all, the eternal flame flickered at the center, a fragile light, upon which Rome believed its future rested. Theirs was not simply a life of devotion. It was a lifetime pledged decade by decade to keep an empire's heart beating. From the moment she entered the Atrium Vestae, the chosen girl no longer belonged to the world of ordinary Roman women. The law stripped her from her family, but in exchange, it clothed her with privileges that seemed unthinkable in a society where most women lived under the shadow of male authority. To outsiders, the life of a Vestal Virgin looked like a paradoxical mixture of cloister and liberation. She was enclosed within sacred walls, yet within those walls, she wielded freedoms denied to nearly every woman in Rome. In the courts of law, her word carried unique weight. Unlike other witnesses, she did not need to swear an oath. Her testimony was assumed to be pure, truthful by nature. A Vestal could make contracts and wills in her own name, something otherwise forbidden to women who always needed the consent of a guardian. She could even own property, outright land and estates that would pass to whomever she designated. In a city that legally defined women as perpetual dependents, these priestesses stood apart as legal actors in their own right. The paradox was clear chosen as children, with no say in their fate. They grew into women whose signatures could sway court cases and whose estates rivaled those of senators. Their privileges were visible not only in court, but in daily life. The crowded streets of Rome pressed even senators and generals into the chaos of carts, vendors, and citizens. Yet, when a Vestal passed, the crowd parted. She rode in a covered carriage, attended by lictors, the same ceremonial escorts who flanked magistrates. To the Roman eye, this was not indulgence, but necessity. A woman who carried the survival of the state in her vows could not be jostled like a commoner in the forum. The city itself bent around her passage. The games revealed another side of her status. At the Colosseum, or the Circus Maximus, where tens of thousands fought for a glimpse of the action seats, were fiercely contested. Senators commanded rows near the front. Emperors presided from gilded boxes. But reserved among them were the places of the Vestals visible to all. They sat shoulder to shoulder with Rome's most powerful men, their white robes gleaming like signals of sanctity amid the roar of the crowd. When gladiators bled in the sand below the Vestal's presence, reminded spectators that Rome's cruelty was always paired with ritual, that even the most brutal spectacle unfolded under divine eyes. Their residence itself testified to this elevated rank. The Atrium Vestae was no simple convent. Archaeology reveals a complex of grand-scale marble floors laid in intricate patterns, fountains playing in open courtyards, statues of past Vestals lining shaded colonnades. Heating systems brought warmth in winter, a luxury even many senators lacked in their homes. The statues in the halls bore inscriptions praising chastity and devotion, turning the building into a gallery of sacred memory. For a girl taken at 6 or 7, this palace became her universe. Its splendor signaled her importance, yet its walls marked the limits of her freedom. The reverence of the Roman people was tangible. A condemned criminal led through the streets to his execution could win reprieve if he encountered a Vestal by chance. Such encounters were seen as divine signs, and no magistrate dared ignore them. To see a Vestal was to brush against sacred favor. Citizens bowed or moved aside when she passed, whispering prayers for her health, for in her body they saw reflected the health of the city itself. Coins and statues portrayed emperors and generals, but the Vestals were the rare women whose faces became widely known, their presence etched into the identity of Rome. And yet, these privileges did not erase the strangeness of their position. While most Roman women were bound tightly within the authority of fathers and husbands, the Vestals moved outside that framework altogether. They were emancipated from the power of men, not to be free in the modern sense, but to be bound instead to a goddess. Their rights were unique, but they were granted not because Rome recognized their individuality, but because Rome demanded their purity. They were honored not for who they were as people, but for what they symbolized as vessels of sacred duty. For the Vestals themselves, this combination of reverence and independence must have felt intoxicating and suffocating all at once. On one hand, they could ride above the crowd, command respect. In court sit in the front rows of the empire's greatest spectacles and live in a palace. On the other, every privilege was tethered to the same condition, that they keep their vows unbroken. Their freedom was real, but conditional, fragile, and reversible. All the wealth and honor could vanish. The instant suspicion fell upon them. This duality set the Vestals apart in the Roman imagination. They were admired as near divine figures, women untouchable by ordinary constraints, mothers to a city. They did not raise brides to a flame they could not touch. Their unique privileges dazzled the people, impressed foreign visitors, and reassured Rome that the gods were close at hand. But beneath that gleaming surface, the true cost was already visible. A life lifted high above other women's came with a net of invisible chains that would tighten with every year of service. For every honor the Vestal Virgins enjoyed, there was an invisible thread binding them tighter to their role. To the eyes of the crowd, they seemed like divine figures, drifting through marble colonnades, wrapped in sacred privileges. Yet, within the Atrium Vestae, the reality was far less free. It was a life as carefully measured as the markings on a sundial, a life that seemed golden from the outside, but felt like a prison from within. The restrictions began the moment the doors of the atrium closed. Every action, from the way a Vestal walked to the tone of her voice in ritual, was subject to scrutiny. She lived under the constant gaze of the Pontifex Maximus and the senior priestesses, but also the city itself. Rome placed her on a pedestal, but a pedestal is not freedom, it is exposure. The very people who moved aside in reverence on the streets could also become her harshest judges at the faintest rumor of failure. Each day was a reminder that her life was not her own, but an offering already promised. Isolation was another form of confinement. She could not marry, could not bear children, could not form attachments outside the order. For Roman women of her generation, family was the natural horizon household duties, raising children, maintaining kinship ties. For the Vestal, that horizon was cut off. Her sisters were other priestesses. Her family became marble walls and an eternal flame. Even her body no longer belonged to her. It was a symbol first, a vessel of purity on which the city's safety rested. Where others might find meaning in love or motherhood, she found only duty repeated like a refrain across decades. The palace itself amplified this paradox. The Atrium Vestae dazzled visitors with marble floors, bubbling fountains, shaded courtyards, and galleries lined with statues of past priestesses. Yet, for the women who lived there, these luxuries carried a strange weight. Each fountain was a reminder of sacred water they alone could draw. Each statue was not just honor, but surveillance. Silent witnesses staring down the corridor as if to warn any failure will erase you from this lineage. It was less a home than a gilded cage, its splendor disguising the strict walls of expectation. The city's devotion added pressure rather than relief. To meet a Vestal in the street was considered good fortune. To see her at the games was a reminder of divine presence. But reverence turned quickly to suspicion. If the sacred flame faltered, if illness or distraction delayed her duties, whispers could erupt into accusations. Rome's belief that the Vestals embodied its survival meant that the women could never be ordinary, never be fallible. They lived in a world where even silence could be misinterpreted, where a single mistake might bring punishment cloaked as ritual. Despite these constraints, the Vestals themselves learned to cultivate composure. Accounts describe them as serene figures, walking with measured steps, speaking rarely, but with authority when they did. That serenity, however, was not simply grace, it was armor. To live under constant scrutiny, to endure decades in which desire and personal choice were stripped away, demanded discipline beyond ritual. It required the ability to suppress fear, to hide grief, and to embody purity not only in deed, but in bearing. They lived as mothers to the city, yet knew they would never cradle children of their own. They lived as brides of the flame, yet never knew the intimacy of a human marriage. They were both exalted and exiled, admired and alone. the gilded prison of the Atrium Vestae thus symbolized a deeper truth about Rome itself. The city wrapped its ideals in marble grandeur and ritual, but beneath the surface was control, sacrifice, and fear of divine displeasure. The Vestals were the perfect embodiment of this paradox. Their palace shimmered with wealth, their privileges shone before the people, but every luxury was balanced by a restriction, every honor shadowed by a threat. To be a Vestal was to live on the sharp edge of reverence and ruin. In time, this tension would grow unbearable for some. Whispers of mistakes, lapses in ritual. Or worse, the breaking of vows would reveal just how fragile the line between exaltation and destruction truly was. For now, though, in the middle of their service, the Vestals lived within walls that glistened in sunlight, admired by a city that depended on them, yet imprisoned by the very reverence that lifted them high. Every Roman knew the Vestal Virgins lived by 3 inviolable laws. These were not mere rules of conduct. They were sacred boundaries that defined the very core of their existence. To cross them, or even to brush against their edge, was to invite disaster, not just for the woman, but for the entire state. To the Roman imagination, these laws were not optional vows, but cosmic contracts, and the Vestals' lives were the living signatures upon them. The first law was perpetual virginity. For 30 years, from the day of their captio until the release of their vows, no intimacy was permitted, no marriage, no children. Virginity was not simply a personal matter, it was a public guarantee. As guardians of the hearth of Rome, the Vestals embodied purity, and purity was seen as a channel through which the goddess Vesta poured her protection upon the city. If that channel were polluted, Rome itself was believed to be stained, and the gods might withdraw their favor. The Vestals' bodies thus ceased to be private. They became symbols, living vessels, whose untouched state reassured an anxious people. The second law was absolute obedience to authority, especially to the Pontifex Maximus. He was not only the chief priest, but the living overseer of their vows. The women might enjoy property and privileges, but in ritual matters they were subject to his scrutiny. If he summoned them, they came. If he instructed them, they obeyed. This obedience did not always mean cruelty, but it always meant dependence. Even the most senior Vestal, having served for decades, stood beneath his authority, a reminder that her sanctity was tied to the structures of male power that governed the Republic and later the Empire. The third law was guardianship of the eternal flame in the temple of Vesta. This fire, burning without interruption, was the beating heart of the city. To Romans, the hearth was sacred in every home, the place where meals were cooked, warmth provided, and ancestors honored. The temple's fire was all of those things raised to a civic scale. It was Rome's hearth, Rome's pulse. If it went out, the omen was dire famine, invasion, or the wrath of the gods. The responsibility placed upon the Vestals was crushing. They alone kept watch over a flame that could never falter. In the stillness of night or the chaos of festivals, they were expected to tend it without fail. The weight of these laws pressed heavily on the women. To fail in even the smallest duty was to risk suspicion of divine anger. If the flame ever died, the blame fell on the Vestals, and the punishment was immediate. Scourging awaited the negligent priestess, administered not in public, but in darkness. Curtains were drawn, the city excluded. The secrecy was meant to preserve the dignity of the woman, yet it only deepened the terror. To feel the whip in silence, unseen, but not unimagined, was to know that one's failure was both hidden and unforgettable. Even rumour could be perilous. A murmur of carelessness might spark an investigation, and in Rome, the gods' anger was too great a risk to allow mercy. The psychological pressure must have been immense. Every flicker of the flame, every ritual uttered with trembling lips carried the weight of an empire. Imagine a girl, barely in her teens' eyes, heavy from sleepless vigils, convinced that if she stumbled or misspoke, the gods might visit calamity upon her city. Rome's grandeur was built on legions and senators, but it also rested on the fragile shoulders of women who could not err. Reverence in this context was indistinguishable from fear, and yet Rome celebrated them. The city marveled at their dignity, pointed to their privileges, praised their role as mothers of the state. Few asked how heavy the burden of those laws really was. For the Vestals themselves, the laws were walls, as unyielding as stone. They confined not only action, but thought, shaping a life where desire was forbidden, disobedience unthinkable, and even a single ember carried the fate of a civilization. These three laws, virginity, obedience, guardianship, were absolute, and they formed the tightrope the Vestals walked every day. On one side lay reverence and privilege, on the other lay disgrace and punishment. The balance could never falter, for the city's faith in its own survival demanded that these women remain forever pure, forever obedient, purgant, forever vigilant. And when those laws were broken, whether in truth or in rumour, the consequences would be darker than anything the scourge in shadow could deliver. The next chapter of their story reveals what Rome feared most, the crime of unchastity and the merciless rituals devised to punish it. If letting the sacred flame go out was a fearful omen, it was nothing compared to the crime Rome most dreaded, the breaking of a Vestal's vow of chastity. To ordinary eyes, chastity might seem a private virtue, a matter of personal conduct. But in the Roman imagination, it was the keystone of cosmic order. When a Vestal was accused of unchastity, crimen incesti, it was not framed as a personal failing. It was an act of sacrilege, a crime against the gods themselves, and through them, a crime against the entire Roman people. The belief ran deep. The Vestals were seen as the living hearth of the city. Their bodies were not their own, but extensions of the sacred flame. Virginity was the symbolic wall protecting that fire. If it was breached, then the fire was polluted, the city stained, and the gods angered. A single act of intimacy, real or alleged, could thus be construed as endangering the empire. Fear magnified suspicion, and suspicion could become condemnation before evidence was even heard. Trials of accused Vestals were unlike other Roman legal proceedings. They carried not just legal weight, but religious dread. Citizens gathered in hushed crowds, aware that the fate of one woman might decide the fortune of the state. The proceedings were overseen by the Pontifex Maximus and the College of Pontiffs, who acted not simply as judges, but as interpreters of divine will. Unlike in ordinary trials, where arguments and evidence were debated, the presumption of guilt loomed heavily over the accused. To acquit a Vestal risked offending the gods. To condemn her was to satisfy their hunger for purity. Mercy, therefore, was rare. The political dimension made these trials even more treacherous. In moments of crisis after military defeats, plagues or famine accusations against Vestals were more likely to surface. The people, desperate for explanations, searched for scapegoats. The priestesses, standing at the fragile intersection of religion and state, made perfect targets. Their fall could be presented as a cleansing act, a sacrifice to restore divine favor. In such cases, guilt mattered less than symbolism. The stigma extended to the men involved. Any man accused of relations with a Vestal faced execution. The Romans saw such intimacy not as seduction or romance, but as treason, an assault upon the security of Rome itself. To touch a Vestal was to lay hands on the very heart of the empire, and the punishment reflected that enormity. Men could be flogged, exiled, or killed, their names erased with equal severity. The weight of crimen incesti lay not only in the punishment, but in its spectacle. The accusation transformed a woman once revered as a near-divine figure into a symbol of corruption. Rome loved its reversals. To see a guardian of purity fall was to dramatize the dangers of impurity, to warn citizens of the fragility of divine favor. The trial was as much a moral theater as a judicial proceeding. Every whispered rumor, every trembling denial, every pronouncement from the Pontifex Maximus was staged before a city anxious to see whether the gods had been appeased. For the Vestals themselves, the fear of this accusation must have been suffocating. They lived in luxury compared to ordinary women, but it was a luxury wrapped in glass. A single crack could shatter everything. Their lives were observed constantly, their gestures weighed against an impossible standard of purity. To be accused of unchastity, even falsely, was to be dragged from honor into disgrace, without defense. Many had no real chance to prove innocence. The machinery of fear and superstition was too strong, and the political utility of their downfall too tempting for Rome's rulers to ignore. In this way, the vow of chastity was not just a vow. It was a trap. It elevated the Vestals above all other women, granting them privileges and reverence. But it also placed them under a sword perpetually hanging above their heads. The people adored them, but that adoration was brittle. When broken, it turned swiftly into fury. A woman who had once been carried in carriages seated beside emperors and saluted as sacred could, in a matter of days, be condemned as a danger to the empire's survival. The crime of unchastity thus reveals Rome at its most paradoxical. It worshipped purity and made women into symbols of that purity, yet it turned on them with merciless ritual when purity was doubted. Honor and destruction lived side by side, and the line between them was thinner than flame. The terror of crimen incesti was not theoretical. Roman history preserves examples whispered through chronicles and magnified by fear, where accusations shattered the lives of Vestal Virgins and echoed through the state. These cases show how religion, politics, and superstition converged, turning women once revered as holy into scapegoats for Rome's misfortunes. One of the earliest and most famous incidents came in 216 BCE, the year of Rome's catastrophic defeat at Cannae by Hannibal of Carthage. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers had been cut down on the battlefield, and the city reeled in grief and terror. When disasters of such scale struck, Romans rarely blamed generals alone. They turned to the gods, searching for signs of impurity that might explain divine anger. That year, two Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were accused of breaking their vows. The charges came at a moment when the city demanded an answer for its suffering. Both women were condemned. Opimia was buried alive. Floronia, according to one account, took her own life before punishment could be carried out. The men implicated with them were scourged to death in the Forum. In the eyes of Rome, this purge cleansed the pollution that had angered the gods. In reality, it revealed the city's desperate need for scapegoats in a time of fear. Another case emerged centuries later under the shadow of an emperor whose reign itself became a scandal. In the early 3rd century CE, Emperor Elagabalus, already notorious for his unconventional behavior and religious innovations, was accused of violating Vestal Virgins. Ancient writers hostile to him painted a lurid picture: the emperor seducing or coercing priestesses, turning Rome's most sacred order into his personal playground. To later historians, these stories reek of exaggeration or even outright fabrication. After his assassination in 222 CE, his enemies had every reason to blacken his memory. What better way than to claim he had desecrated the Vestals, the very embodiment of Rome's purity? Whether true or not, the accusations stuck, shaping his legacy as a ruler who defiled both tradition and divinity. These cases highlight the double edge of the Vestals' position. They were untouchable in theory, honored as living symbols of Rome's survival. Yet in practice, their untouchability made them perfect sacrificial victims when the city demanded someone to blame. To accuse a Vestal was to turn religion into a weapon, a way of channeling collective anxiety into a ritual of purification. The women themselves had little chance to resist. Their guilt or innocence mattered less than the message their punishment sent, that Rome was cleansing itself of corruption and renewing its bond with the gods. The men involved in these accusations were punished just as brutally. Unlike ordinary crimes of passion, intimacy with a Vestal was treated as treason. The state executed men implicated in these scandals, often by scourging to reinforce the message that such contact was not merely illicit, but an attack on Rome itself. The death of these men underscored the principle that to touch a Vestal was to endanger the empire, a crime no less serious than betrayal on the battlefield. The repetition of these cases across centuries reveals how deeply superstition and politics intertwined in Roman life. Each trial, each execution, each burial alive was remembered not only as punishment for individual sins, but as public theatre. The city reassured itself that by casting out impurity, it could restore divine favour. Behind the spectacle, however, stood women whose lives had been consumed by duty, now reduced to symbols of Rome's fear and fury. Through these stories, the fragility of the Vestals' exalted status becomes clear. They could be honoured as divine mothers one day and condemned as polluted scapegoats the next. Their lives were lived on a knife's edge, where devotion brought reverence, but suspicion brought annihilation. It was this precarious balance that gave the order its aura of sanctity, but also its atmosphere of dread. And when dread demanded a ritual answer, the most merciless punishment Rome could imagine awaited them: the burial alive. The terror of crimen incesti was not theoretical. Roman history preserves examples whispered through chronicles and magnified by fear, where accusations shattered the lives of Vestal Virgins and echoed through the state. These cases show how religion, politics, and superstition converged, turning women once revered as holy into scapegoats for Rome's misfortunes. One of the earliest and most famous incidents came in 216 BCE, the year of Rome's catastrophic defeat at Cannae by Hannibal of Carthage. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers had been cut down on the battlefield, and the city reeled in grief and terror. When disasters of such scale struck, Romans rarely blamed generals alone. They turned to the gods, searching for signs of impurity that might explain divine anger. That year, 2 Vestals, Orpimia and Floronia, were accused of breaking their vows. The charges came at a moment when the city demanded an answer for its suffering. Both women were condemned. Opimia was buried alive. Floronia, according to one account, took her own life before punishment could be carried out. The men implicated with them were scourged to death in the Forum. In the eyes of Rome, this purge cleansed the pollution that had angered the gods. In reality, it revealed the city's desperate need for scapegoats in a time of fear. Another case emerged centuries later under the shadow of an emperor, whose reign itself became a scandal. In the early 3rd century CE, Emperor Elagabalus, already notorious for his unconventional behavior and religious innovations, was accused of violating Vestal Virgins. Ancient writers hostile to him painted a lurid picture, the emperor seducing or coercing priestesses, turning Rome's most sacred order into his personal playground. To later historians, these stories reek of exaggeration or even outright fabrication. After his assassination in 222 CE, his enemies had every reason to blacken his memory. What better way than to claim he had desecrated the Vestals, the very embodiment of Rome's purity? Whether true or not, the accusations stuck, shaping his legacy as a ruler who defiled both tradition and divinity. These cases highlight the double edge of the Vestals' position. They were untouchable in theory, honored as living symbols of Rome's survival. Yet, in practice, their untouchability made them perfect sacrificial victims when the city demanded someone to blame. To accuse a Vestal was to turn religion into a weapon, a way of channeling collective anxiety into a ritual of purification. The women themselves had little chance to resist. Their guilt or innocence mattered less than the message their punishment sent that Rome was cleansing itself of corruption and renewing its bond with the gods. The men involved in these accusations were punished just as brutally. Unlike ordinary crimes of passion intimacy with a Vestal was treated as treason. The state executed men implicated in these scandals, often by scourging to reinforce the message that such contact was not merely illicit, but an attack on Rome itself. The death of these men underscored the principle that to touch a Vestal was to endanger the empire, a crime no less serious than betrayal on the battlefield. The repetition of these cases across centuries reveals how deeply superstition and politics intertwined in Roman life. Each trial, each execution, each burial alive was remembered not only as punishment for individual sins, but as public theatre. The city reassured itself that by casting out impurity, it could restore divine favour. Behind the spectacle, however, stood women whose lives had been consumed by duty, now reduced to symbols of Rome's fear and fury. Through these stories, the fragility of the Vestals' exalted status becomes clear. They could be honoured as divine mothers one day and condemned as polluted scapegoats the next. Their lives were lived on a knife's edge, where devotion brought reverence, but suspicion brought annihilation. It was this precarious balance that gave the order its aura of sanctity, but also its atmosphere of dread. And when dread demanded a ritual answer, the most merciless punishment Rome could imagine awaited them: the burial alive. The Romans prided themselves on their laws, their rituals, their devotion to order. Yet, when a Vestal Virgin was condemned for breaking her vows, that devotion twisted into something both solemn and monstrous. Rome faced a problem: the Vestals were sacred, and no Roman hand was permitted to spill their blood. To execute them by ordinary means was to risk divine wrath, for the touch of iron or the spilling of sacred blood would itself pollute the city. The solution they devised was both ingenious and horrifying. They would bury the woman alive, entombing her in silence beneath the earth, claiming that they had not killed her at all, but merely left her to the gods. The place for this punishment lay just outside the Colline Gate, north of the city walls, in a field the Romans called the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked. Even its name served as a warning. This was no ordinary place of execution. It was a ritual ground, a space where purity once thought unbreakable was cast into the earth and erased. Every Roman knew where it was, and every Roman understood what it meant. To be led there was not just to die, but to vanish from memory. The ritual began in the heart of the city, at the Forum, where the condemned woman was dressed not in the garb of a prisoner, but of a bride. She wore the bridal veil, the flammeum her face shrouded, in the orange-red fabric that normally signaled joy and union. Yet, this was a wedding, without a groom, a marriage not to a man, but to death itself. At her side were attendants who carried her small bundle of provisions, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, a lamp, and sometimes a little milk. These items were a legal fiction meant to absolve the city of responsibility. Rome could claim it had not starved her, had not wielded weapons against her, but had given her the bare minimum to live. What happened next was, in their words, up to the gods. But every witness knew the truth. She would suffocate in darkness, her light extinguished forever. The procession through the Forum was conducted in silence. No songs, no shouts, no prayers. Citizens lined the streets and watched the figure pass veiled and solemn, as though they were attending both a wedding and a funeral at once. The atmosphere was heavy with dread. To look upon the condemned Vestal was to look upon the embodiment of impurity, yet also to feel the horror of Rome turning its sacred daughter into a sacrifice. Many must have looked away, while others watched with morbid fascination, knowing they were seeing a ritual that defined the limits of both piety and cruelty. When the procession reached the field of the wicked, a small underground chamber awaited. It was not a simple pit, but a constructed room, a strange parody of a living space. Inside was a couch, a lamp, the bread and water, and sometimes oil for the lamp. These objects mocked domestic life, as though the Vestal were moving into a new household. Yet, she was not becoming a wife or a mother. She was becoming an absence swallowed by earth. Once she entered, attendants sealed the entrance with earth and stone. The chamber was closed, the ground smoothed, and Rome turned its back. No tombstone marked the site. No prayers were said. She was erased as though she had never existed. The irony was unbearable. In life, these women had been revered as living symbols of purity, seated beside emperors, their word honored in courts, their presence treated as divine blessing. In death, they were discarded like criminals denied memory, their names stricken from Rome's collective honor. A Vestal's life was meant to guarantee Rome's survival. Her death, when it came, was staged as proof that Rome had cleansed itself of pollution. She became not a person, but a ritual act, a sacrifice offered to restore the balance between gods and men. Why did the Romans maintain such a punishment? Part of the answer lies in their view of religion. To them, ritual was not symbolic, but binding. To anger the gods was to invite famine invasion or plague. If a Vestal's purity was broken, the city itself was polluted, and only an act of equal severity could purge the stain. Burying her alive was less an execution than an offering. Rome claimed It was not killing a sacred woman, but returning her to divine judgment. The fiction soothed the conscience of the city, but it did little to mask the cruelty of entombing someone in darkness and silence. The political dimension cannot be ignored either. Accusations of unchastity often arose in times of crisis, military defeats, famines, or unrest. Condemning a Vestal provided both a scapegoat and a spectacle. It reassured the people that their leaders were taking action, that the gods' anger had been appeased. In this way, the punishment functioned as political theatre. It dramatized Rome's willingness to sacrifice even its most honored women for the sake of divine favor. The more exalted the victim, the greater the sense of renewal. To modernize, the practice appears barbaric, an act of collective hypocrisy, by a society that worshipped women as divine one moment and cast them into the earth the next. But to the Romans, the paradox was the point. Their greatness, they believed, demanded absolute purity, and absolute purity demanded absolute sacrifice. In the burial of a Vestal, they saw not cruelty, but necessity. A ritual act that safeguarded the city, even as it destroyed the individual. It is this ritual, the procession, the chamber, the silence that lingers as one of the darkest realities of Roman religion. It revealed the limits of privilege, the fragility of honor, and the terrifying power of superstition. The field of the wicked was both a grave and a warning that no one, not even Rome's most sacred daughters, was beyond the reach of ritual law. The burial of a Vestal Virgin was staged with grim precision, but the heart of the ritual lay within the tomb itself. To the Romans, it was essential that the act did not appear as outright execution. The chamber was arranged not as a dungeon, but as a distorted parody of a home. When the condemned Vestal descended into the earth, she found not a pit of despair, but a small room, furnished with deliberate symbols, a couch, a lamp, a few vessels, bread, water, and sometimes a little milk. These objects, meaningless in practice, were Rome's attempt to cloak cruelty in ritual. By giving her the trappings of life, the city could claim it had not killed her, but merely left her in the care of the gods. The pretense was transparent. No lamp, no loaf, no jug could stave off suffocation in the sealed chamber. But ritual, not mercy, dictated the arrangement. Accounts describe how the chamber was narrow and low built, deep enough to ensure there was no escape. The couch suggested rest, yet its presence mocked the comfort of sleep. The lamp suggested light, yet once oil was gone, darkness would close in. The bread and water suggested sustenance, yet in such small amounts, they were an insult to the idea of survival. Everything inside the tomb served to maintain the illusion of life while guaranteeing death. It was a stage set, and the condemned woman was both actress and victim in Rome's cruelest performance. Above once, she had entered, attendants sealed the entrance with heavy stones and packed the earth over it. The silence was final. Citizens who had followed the procession in uneasy quiet knew that the woman was alive beneath their feet, but already counted among the dead. The field of the wicked was transformed into her grave, yet no monument marked it. Rome denied her a tombstone, denied her a name carved into memory. She was erased as though she had never existed. For a city that raised statues to victorious generals and even courtesans, the absence was deliberate. The punishment was not only death, but oblivion. The psychology of this act is difficult to overstate. A woman who had lived in marble halls, who had ridden in carriages, who had been greeted with reverence in the streets, was reduced in the end to silence beneath the earth. The grandeur of her life made her obliteration all the more striking. Rome demanded absolute obedience from its sacred daughters, and when that obedience was judged broken, it demanded their disappearance. No prayers were offered, no mourning permitted. The burial was not framed as punishment, but as purification. Rome's conscience was soothed by the fiction that it was the gods, not the people, who decided her fate. The experience inside the tomb must have been terror beyond words. The lamp flickering as oil dwindled, the air growing stale, the silence pressing in. The bread untouched, perhaps because the appetite failed in such despair. The couch a poor comfort in a place that was neither home nor grave. Each object mocked survival, as if Rome itself had turned domestic life into a cruel satire. To be buried alive is to die slowly with full knowledge of one's fate. And this was precisely the point. The city demanded not only the woman's life, but her erasure through suffering. The cruelty was matched by irony. In life, the Vestal's purity was celebrated as the guarantee of Rome's survival. Citizens moved aside in reverence. When they passed, criminals found reprieve. By chance encounters with them, senators seated them in places of honor. In death, all of that dissolved. The woman who had embodied Rome's stability was declared its pollutant. Her privileges did not protect her. Indeed, they made her fall more dramatic. The higher she had been exalted, the more powerful the ritual of her destruction became. Rome staged her burial as a drama of renewal, cleansing the state by consuming its most sacred vessel. To later historians, such as Livy and Plutarch, the burial of a Vestal was one of the darkest stains upon Roman religion. They described the processions, the veils, the chamber, with a tone of both awe and horror. They recognized the paradox, the same society that built temples of marble and celebrated itself as a beacon of order, sanctioned a punishment that erased its most revered women in silence and earth. For them, the ritual was proof that Rome's greatness was built not only on law and discipline, but also on fear and sacrifice. The field of the wicked thus became a place of memory and forgetting at once. No stone marked the women who perished there, but every Roman knew its soil-covered bodies once revered as sacred. It was both an erasure and a reminder, a blank space that whispered of the price Rome demanded for purity. To step near it was to feel unease, to remember that honor in Rome could vanish in an instant, and that even those most exalted lived under the shadow of annihilation. Inside that tomb, a Vestal Virgin ceased to be a person. She became a symbol of Rome's fears, of its rituals, of its brutal insistence on purity. She was transformed from guardian of the hearth to offering in the earth. Her lamp extinguished her name forgotten. She embodied the ultimate paradox of Rome, a city that revered its sacred women as divine, yet condemned them to the most merciless death imaginable when suspicion fell. The burial of a Vestal Virgin was not merely a punishment, but a message etched into the consciousness of Rome. Though no tombstone was raised, no prayers uttered, the silence around their deaths spoke volumes. The act itself was meant to erase them from history, yet, paradoxically, it became one of the most remembered features of Roman religion. Writers such as Livy and Plutarch recorded the details, preserving what Rome officially tried to deny, that beneath the solemn rituals and marble temples lay a system that demanded absolute obedience, enforced by terror. These accounts are striking for their tone. Livy describes the processions with grave formality, acknowledging both the reverence for the Vestals and the horror of their end. Plutarch, writing centuries later, treated the ritual as proof of Rome's contradictions, its lofty ideals of piety paired with punishments of unimaginable cruelty. For both the burial of a Vestal was not an aberration, but a revelation. It showed how far Rome would go to maintain its fragile balance with the gods, and how the bodies of women were used as instruments of that balance. The memory of these rituals lingered precisely because they embodied the paradox at the heart of Roman religion. The Vestals were exalted as near-divine figures, elevated above ordinary women with privileges that bordered on royal. They were seated beside emperors, at the games honored in courts, treated with reverence in the streets. Yet, at the same time, their existence was precarious. One accusation, one lapse real or imagined, and all that honor could vanish. Their privileges and their punishments were two sides of the same coin. A reminder that reverence in Rome was always conditional, always tied to service that demanded perfection. This duality gave the Vestals symbolic power. They represented Rome itself, powerful, honored, central to the survival of the state, yet always at risk of collapse if purity faltered. The flame they tended was both literal and metaphorical, a small fire that embodied the endurance of an empire. Its brightness was linked to their virtue, its extinction to their failure. When they succeeded, Rome thrived. When they were accused, Rome believed itself threatened, and their destruction became necessary to restore divine favor. The Vestals thus became living metaphors for the city's anxieties, their live stages upon which Rome's fear of chaos and need for control were endlessly played out. Archaeology reinforces this paradox. The Atrium Vestae, with its marble floors, fountains, and statues, testifies to the grandeur of their position. Statues of past Vestals lined the corridors, each inscribed with her name and virtues, presenting an unbroken lineage of purity and devotion. Yet those who were condemned left no statues, no names, no memorials. Their erasure was part of the ritual. Where marble honored some silence, consumed others. The very building that celebrated the order's glory also hinted at its fragility. For every statue that stood there was another woman whose likeness was never carved, whose story ended in earth and darkness. The meaning of this system extended beyond the women themselves. To the Roman people, the Vestal's fate was a lesson. Their privileges reminded citizens of the rewards of purity and service. Their punishments warned of the dangers of impurity and disobedience. The ritual burial was not simply about punishing one woman, but about instructing an entire city. It dramatized the consequences of failure, ensuring that fear reinforced devotion. Rome's greatness, it suggested, depended not only on armies and laws, but on the fragile bodies of women who lived as symbols, constantly balancing reverence and ruin. Yet, in remembering these rituals, we also glimpse Rome's contradictions laid bare. A society that celebrated its civilization, its order, its law, enacted a punishment that erased individuals in silence. A society that exalted its sacred women above all others, treated them as disposable when suspicion fell. A society that claimed to honor memory denied memory to those who failed. The burial of the Vestals thus forces us to confront not only the cruelty of Rome, but also the mechanisms by which power sustains itself through spectacle, through fear, and through the sacrifice of individuals for the survival of the collective. In the end, the memory of the Vestal's burial became larger than the women themselves. They became symbols of a civilization that wrapped brutality in ritual, that disguised fear as piety, that demanded perfection while offering only conditional honor. To study them is to see Rome in its starkest form, magnificent, disciplined, devout, and merciless. Their story reminds us that the past is never simple, that glory and cruelty often share the same stage, and that even those who seemed closest to divine power could be cast into silence when the city demanded a sacrifice. The story of the Vestal Virgins closes not with their disappearance into the soil, but with the legacy they left in Roman memory and in ours. For nearly a millennium, these women stood at the heart of the empire, their lives woven into its rituals, their purity believed to guarantee its survival. Their exaltation and destruction reveal more than the fate of a few priestesses. They illuminate the paradox of Rome itself, a civilization that built monuments to eternity, yet demanded human sacrifices in silence. The legacy of the Vestals is inseparable from Rome's obsession with control. They were honored with privileges no other women could dream of: property rights seats beside emperor's authority in courts. Yet, these privileges were a bargain tethered to absolute obedience and the maintenance of purity. In their lives, the Vestals embodied the glory of Rome, appearing almost superhuman in their sanctity. But their deaths showed the fragility of that glory. A single accusation could erase decades of service, demonstrating that Rome's stability was built on fear as much as faith. The legacy, then, is a reminder that power often clothes its cruelties in ritual and its fears in the language of piety. For modern readers, the Vestals provoke uneasy questions. Why did a society so advanced in law, architecture, and governance persist in a ritual that buried women alive? The answer lies in the way Rome understood religion. For the Romans, piety was not a private matter, but a civic duty. The gods had to be appeased, and any hint of impurity was considered dangerous to the entire community. The burial of a Vestal was framed not as punishment, but as purification. To Rome, the sacrifice was justified because it restored cosmic balance. To us, it reveals how collective fear can justify cruelty, how societies can rationalize the destruction of individuals for the supposed survival of the whole. Their story also resonates beyond antiquity. Across cultures and centuries, societies have created figures, often women whose lives are made symbolic, whose worth is measured not in individuality, but in what they represent for the collective. Whether cloistered nuns, child brides, or political scapegoats, the pattern repeats. Reverence mingled with restriction, honor shadowed by erasure. The Vestals remind us that the line between exaltation and oppression is perilously thin, and that the same society that elevates can just as quickly destroy. The paradox of the Vestals is that their power and their peril were one and the same. Their privileges were dazzling, but their vulnerability was profound. Rome could not exist without them, yet, when suspicion fell, Rome could not forgive them. They embodied the city's greatness and its cruelty, its devotion and its fear. Their flame burned as a symbol of endurance, but their burials revealed the cost of that endurance. In them, we see how a civilization can both honor and consume its most sacred symbols. And so, we are left with questions. Were the Vestals victims of superstition, martyrs to Rome's anxieties, or willing participants in a system that offered them a kind of power no other women could achieve? Did they themselves believe in the sacred duty that bound them? Or did they live in quiet dread, knowing how fragile their honor truly was? These questions have no simple answers, but they echo across time, challenging us to examine the ways our own societies exalt and sacrifice honor and erase. The story of the Vestals is not just a tale of antiquity, it is a mirror. It reflects the contradictions of Rome, but also the contradictions that live in every civilization that demands individuals carry the weight of collective ideals. The marble temples may have crumbled, the eternal flame long extinguished, but the legacy of the Vestal Virgins endures as a lesson, a warning, and a haunting reminder of the price some are forced to pay for the survival of the many.